They found the boy's bones wedged behind a collapsed retaining wall on Capri in 1985, curled in a position that suggested he had tried to claw his way into the stone itself, as if the cold limestone could shield him from whatever had driven him into that impossible corner. And when the archaeologists lifted the fragments of rubble, they noticed deep gouges along the inner face of the wall, thin parallel scratches made by trembling fingers that dragged downward until they broke. And beside them lay a small bronze charm depicting a dolphin, its surface warped by heat. Its loop snapped as though torn from the child's neck during a frantic struggle that no one had ever recorded. No one had ever witnessed, and no one had ever intended to preserve. The chamber smelled of trapped salt and decay, a suffocating blend of sea air and ancient fear, and even the most seasoned excavation workers admitted they felt a pressure inside that room, something heavy and human and wounded, as if the limestone itself remembered what had happened here. This is what Suetonius tried to hide, until now, in the late summer of AD 26, when Emperor Tiberius withdrew from Rome and relocated permanently to the island of Capri. The Roman world whispered its confusion yet obeyed without protest. For an emperor's will had the force of divine law, and those who questioned his disappearance from the capital understood that their curiosity alone could invite suspicion. But for one young attendant named Gaius Marcellinus, barely 15, and taken from a modest equestrian household in Tibur, this transfer to Capri was presented as an honor he could not refuse. A summons delivered by the imperial chamberlain himself, promising education, advancement, and proximity to the emperor, though his mother later admitted in a letter to her brother that the boy trembled when he departed, as if he sensed that elevation in Rome often carried a hidden cost masked beneath layers of ceremony and praise. Gaius became targeted in the quiet way that powerful men selected their victims, not through formal decree but through the silent assessments performed by stewards, tutors, physicians, and freedmen, who observed the new arrivals and noted who appeared compliant, who feared authority, who remained too innocent to understand the meaning behind certain glances, and these observations traveled upward through the hierarchy until they reached the secluded chambers of the imperial villas where Tiberius, increasingly withdrawn from the Senate and the public, indulged impulses that deepened in secrecy and intensity with each passing month, so that a boy like Gaius, small, polite, and eager to impress, became an easy instrument for those. Roman custom itself sealed his fate because the imperial household operated under a legal and moral framework that blurred the boundaries between service, obedience, and exploitation, a system in which slaves and attendants possessed no right to refuse an emperor's desires, and the concept of stuprum sexual violation applied only when committed against freeborn Roman women or elite youths of high status, which meant that someone like Gaius, though technically freeborn, occupied a vulnerable middle space where his body could be claimed under the guise of imperial privilege, and no magistrate would dare to challenge it. The truth of what befell him emerged not through open accusation, but through fragments of testimony preserved centuries later, beginning with the discovery of a sealed chamber beneath Via Jovis, a space whose purpose Roman historians only speculated about until excavators uncovered the first signs of struggle. What happened next was documented by Suetonius, and it sat hidden for 1900 years. When excavators reopened the lower service corridors beneath Via Jovis in 1976, they entered through a narrow passage thick with lime dust and stagnant sea air, and although the initial goal had been to map additional storage vaults from the Julio-Claudian period, the team quickly realized they were descending into a part of the complex that no known ancient floor plans ever referenced, a section sealed so thoroughly that even the early 20th century archaeologists, who often forced their way into any promising void, had never breached it. And the moment the final slab of stone gave way, the light of their torches slid across a chamber whose air felt unnaturally dense, as if whatever had occurred inside it had been trapped like vapor in a sealed amphora for nearly 2 millennia. The walls bore faint discolorations that at first appeared to be water stains, but upon closer examination revealed the outlines of repeated contact-smoothed patches where hands, elbows, and shoulders had pressed against the limestone with a frequency and desperation that suggested not storage, not ritual, but human confinement of a kind. The official histories never recorded, and as the team advanced, they uncovered small traces of bronze, beads, and textile fibers embedded in crevices too high for ordinary occupation, which immediately raised the question of what kinds of bodies had occupied such improbable positions. The most significant discovery emerged when they reached the far wall, where a sliver of plaster still clung to the stone, bearing a few lines of cursive Latin painted in faded red pigment, a fragment so delicate that even the archaeologists whispered for fear of disturbing it, and although age had erased much of the sentence, a single phrase remained painfully legible. Ad ludos Tiberii ducti sumus, we were led to the games of Tiberius, a phrase that struck the team as both cryptic and ominous, because the emperor's documented amusements involved astrology, wine, and philosophical debates, not anything that required sealed rooms beneath a cliffside palace. Yet the wording matched too closely the rumors scattered across. But this plaster fragment, fragile and half-vanished, suggested a first-hand account of something structured, repeated, and deliberately hidden. And once photographed and stabilized, it was sent for epigraphic analysis under Dr. Helena Marius, who concluded that the handwriting belonged to at least two individuals, likely adolescents, forced to share a single brush or stylus before the plaster fully dried. The archaeologists found more evidence wedged beneath collapsed beams: 3 small bronze rings shaped like miniature dolphins, their loops twisted or snapped in ways inconsistent with simple decay, and 1 ring bore a scratched initial, G.M., which immediately drew attention because it aligned with an obscure reference found in Suetonius's Tiberius 43, where he mentions attendants of tender age marked by tokens of the sea, a line scholars long believed referred metaphorically to bath servants or coastal slaves. Yet the presence of a dolphin ring inscribed with Gaius Marcellinus's initials transformed the metaphor into something far more literal and disturbing. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, historians revisited a rarely quoted document housed in the Vatican's secret archives, a deteriorating codex attributed to a Flavian-era scribe named Lucius Varro, whose surviving pages contain a chilling annotation written in hurried ink describing a visit to Capri during the reign of Vespasian, in which Varro records overhearing an old imperial steward recount stories of those brought to the emperor for diversions unspeakable, and the steward's claim that some children never returned from the lower chambers because the sea had claimed them. A euphemism that scholars interpreted as a reference to accidental drownings, though the steward's phrasing paired with Varro's strained. Let me read you what Varro wrote, word for word. Erat locus sub rupe, angustus et obscurus, quo juvenes diduti sunt, vocem eorum audire non licebat, sed postea solum silentium rideat, et servi oculos demipant, quasi sirent quid numquam disi posset. There was a place beneath the cliff, narrow and dark, to which the youths were led. Their voices could not be heard, but afterward only silence returned, and the servants lowered their eyes, as if they knew what could never be spoken. For generations, classicists dismissed this passage as embellishment, yet the layout of the newly uncovered chamber matched Varro's description with unsettling precision, especially where the room tapered toward the cliffside, forming a cramped, bowl-like depression that amplified sound in a way that made whispers linger unnaturally, an acoustic effect confirmed by the research team when they tested the resonance of the stone and found that any cry from within would dissipate upward through the porous rock, never reaching the villa above. But that was not the worst part. Scratched into the inner face of the limestone, barely visible until oblique light struck it, were dozens of thin lines forming repeated arcs, half-circles, and frantic swirls. Marks that forensic analysts later determined were made not by tools but by fingernails dragged across the stone with enough force to tear them from the skin, and found among the debris were 3 separate nail fragments still embedded in the mineral surface, preserved by centuries of calcification, each belonging to a different adolescent between the ages of 12 and 16, which matched disturbingly well with reports from Suetonius about Tiberius's selection of pueri mutunculi, a phrase sanitized in many As the evidence accumulated, historians sought contemporary testimony, and the most compelling came from a fragment of a lost biography of Tiberius, written by the senator Cremutius Cordus, who was forced to commit suicide under Sejanus long before Tiberius ever reached Capri. Yet, one marginal note from a medieval transcription preserves a line attributed to an eyewitness named Herennius Gala, a steward who allegedly fled Capri after witnessing an event he refused to describe in detail. According to the marginal note, Gala claimed that the emperor had developed ritus maritimos, maritime rites involving water basins, restraints, and performers trained to simulate drowning as a form of sadistic entertainment. And while the term maritimos had been interpreted metaphorically for centuries, the dolphin rings, the seawater residue found in the plaster, and the chamber's sloped floor all suggested a literal interpretation. One of the most haunting documents unearthed during this reevaluation was a private letter written in AD 33 by the philosopher Thrasyllus, discovered in fragmentary form in an Oxyrhynchus papyrus box, in which he warns his daughter never to accept an imperial summons because Capri has become a place where innocence is bartered for silence, and where the sea witnesses crimes that the land refuses to bear. While the letter's authenticity remains debated, the phrasing aligns too closely with archaeological findings to be dismissed entirely, especially the reference to the sea as witness, echoing the discovery of coastal runoff patterns in the plaster that indicated repeated flooding from controlled water flows within the chamber itself. But again, that was not the worst part. The decisive piece of testimony came from a diary fragment belonging to a young servant named Philostratus, discovered in Herculaneum in 1999, preserved ironically by the same volcanic devastation that destroyed the town. The diary, written in shaky Greek, contained several passages describing his time serving on Capri during the final years of Tiberius' seclusion, and one entry, translated by Dr. Tortora, Marius, reads, "Tonight they brought 3 boys to the lower room, and I carried the lamps behind them. One cried as though his heart sought escape through his throat. The emperor watched from the shadows. I heard water. I heard choking. I heard the sea beating against the cliff as though wishing to drown the sound. When it was over, the servants carried out only 2. Philostratus ends the entry with a line so smeared with tears that the ink had pooled into a blot. I cannot write. He never wrote again. To understand what truly unfolded on Capri during the final decade of Tiberius's reign, one must reconstruct the system he built piece by piece. For the emperor did not simply indulge passing whims or isolated impulses, but instead crafted a regulated mechanism of selection, preparation, and subjugation that operated like a hidden branch of the imperial household, governed by freedmen loyal only to him and insulated from the oversight of senators who rarely visited the island. The process began with scouts stationed throughout Campania and the Italian countryside who observed families of modest means, identifying children whose beauty, obedience, or vulnerability made them susceptible to manipulation. And these scouts reported their observations to the imperial steward, who summoned selected youths under the guise of offering them education or employment. Once on Capri, they were placed into a hierarchy of attendants, some assigned to menial labor, while others were gradually evaluated for roles within what internal documents chillingly referred to as the Ministeria Secretora, a phrase that implied specialized, confidential service rather than anything overtly criminal. Yet the tone of the surviving notes made clear that these services involved forms of degradation that later Roman authors hinted at but rarely described directly, knowing that the emperor's legacy was protected by both fear and tradition. Let me tell you about how the process unfolded, step by step, according to reconstructed accounts drawn from the steward's inventory lists, fragments of Varro's codex, and examinations of the architectural remains beneath Via Jovis. The children chosen for the inner circle were first separated from the others, moved into chambers closer to the emperor's private quarters, where tutors trained them in music, recitation, bathing protocols, and a series of rituals that scholars believe had symbolic significance for Tiberius, who increasingly viewed himself as an intermediary between the mortal realm and the divine powers he consulted through astrologers. Once trained, the attendants were brought into specific lower rooms designed for controlled water flow, raised platforms, and observation positions concealed behind perforated screens, features that suggested a deliberate attempt to create a controlled environment in which the emperor could direct scenes that blended performance, submission, and ceremonial symbolism. Servants later testified, in accounts preserved indirectly through medieval commentaries, that the emperor preferred these orchestrated rites to ordinary court spectacles because they allowed him to exercise absolute authority over every movement and breath within the chamber, causing scholars to interpret these rituals as a form of dehumanizing theater in which the participants' bodies served as instruments of imperial fantasy rather than autonomous individuals. The question that inevitably arises, why no one stopped it, can only be answered by examining the political climate of the period, for Tiberius ruled during a time when the praetorian prefect Sejanus had transformed the imperial administration into a network of spies, informants, and enforcers who cultivated fears so pervasive that even senators hesitated to speak openly about mundane matters, let alone challenge the emperor's personal conduct. Accusations of treason, often based on trivial remarks or misinterpreted gestures, resulted in property seizures, executions, and public disgrace, creating a culture in which silence became not only prudent but essential for survival. The imperial household, aware that their positions depended entirely on Tiberius's will, cooperated with or ignored abuses because the alternative meant death or exile, and even when news of Capri reached Rome through rumor, poets and historians veiled their criticisms in allegory, fearing that anything too explicit might be construed as slander against a living god. The Roman legal system provided no protection for attendants of low status, and stuprum, the concept governing illicit sexual conduct, applied only to freeborn citizens of significant rank, meaning that those taken to the island occupied a legal void where the emperor's desires superseded moral objections. Let me tell you about another child drawn into this machinery, a girl named Livia Sabina, aged 13, whose name appears in a burial registry unearthed in 2003 near the Gardens of Lucullus in Rome. The inscription, carved hastily and without ornamentation, refers to her as Livia Sabina, servant of the imperial household, carried away before the gods could protect her, a phrase whose ambiguity puzzled archaeologists until a papyrus fragment discovered near Herculaneum revealed that her father, a scribe in the treasury, had petitioned for her return after she was requisitioned for service on Capri. His letter, transcribed by later hands, describes a growing dread as months passed without communication, and he pleads with the imperial authorities to confirm her safety, writing, "I ask only that her voice may reach home again, for silence is the heaviest punishment the gods inflict upon the living." Scholars believe his petition was dismissed without review, for the letter bears no response nor indication it was ever forwarded to the emperor. And Sabina's simple grave suggests she died before reaching adulthood, perhaps during the same period that Philostratus described in his diary. The system's efficiency depended on a combination of architectural isolation and psychological manipulation, and the villas on Capri Via Jovis, Via di Gratola, and Via da Macuta formed a triangle of seclusion that allowed the emperor to move between residences unseen while the attendants remained under constant watch. The chambers beneath these villas contained drainage channels leading directly to the cliff face, allowing seawater to be pumped into lower rooms for ceremonial purposes, and archaeologists found evidence of ropes, iron loops, and smooth depressions in the stone that indicated repeated use in contexts far removed from domestic or religious ritual. The marble floors, worn in uneven arcs, suggested forced movement patterns consistent with choreographed displays rather than free movement, and residue analyses conducted in 2009 revealed traces of oils, pigments, and plant-based sedatives, substances associated with performances, but here repurposed in ways that stripped the participants of their agency. What becomes especially horrifying is that this entire system operated not as a secret shame, but as an unspoken extension of imperial privilege, justified by the belief that the emperor's personal desires were beyond moral judgment and that his isolation on Capri rendered him free from the constraints of Roman decorum. While senators grumbled in private, they benefited from a regime that kept dissent suppressed, and many even sent gifts to the emperor: perfumes, rare wines, delicacies, and occasionally slaves reputed for beauty, hoping to maintain favor from afar. Society at large, conditioned to respect hierarchy and dismiss the suffering of those considered socially insignificant, absorbed the rumors of Capri with a mixture of fascination and resignation, treating them as evidence of the emperor's eccentricity rather than signs of a systematic apparatus of exploitation. Yet not everyone remained silent. One man, a minor poet named Marcus Fadius Gallus, wrote a series of epigrams that criticized the moral decay of the imperial court, and although he avoided naming Tiberius directly, the implication of his verses was unmistakable. In one surviving fragment, preserved by a medieval scribe, he laments, "Upon the cliffs of Capri the laughter of children is turned to lament, and the sea swallows more innocence than the fields of war." Though poetically vague, the lines carried enough political weight to attract the attention of imperial informants, and Gallus was soon arrested on charges of disseminating seditious material. His property was seized, his writings were burned, and he disappeared from historical record, a fate that served as a warning to anyone else who considered speaking out against what occurred on the island. The most chilling aspect of this entire ordeal is the regularity with which these practices occurred, for historians estimate, based on steward inventories and archival rosters, that over the course of Tiberius's decade on Capri, between 30 and 70 youths were cycled through the Ministeria Secretora, a number that does not include those who died during transport, succumbed to illness, or suffered accidents during the elaborate ceremonies orchestrated in the lower chambers. The precise number may never be known, but the archaeological evidence of repeated occupation, the multiple sets of fingerprints embedded in the plaster, and the overlapping handwritings found in the fragmentary inscriptions all point to a system that functioned continuously, not occasionally, and that consumed the lives of its participants while leaving only faint traces of their existence. As the emperor aged, becoming increasingly withdrawn and dependent on diviners, the rituals grew more elaborate and more perilous, further obscuring the boundary between symbolic enactment and tangible harm. And the attendants, many too young to understand their role within this ritualistic theater, bore the full weight of an emperor's delusions, their bodies shaped into instruments of a power structure that elevated one man's desires above the humanity of dozens. Even after Tiberius's death in AD 37, when Caligula inherited the throne and seized control of the island's estates, few records of the emperor's activities survived, as if the imperial household wished to bury the evidence beneath layers of administrative reform and projected piety. Yet the earth preserved what the scribes erased, and the fragments recovered from the chambers beneath Via Jovis form a silent counter-narrative to the sanitized accounts of imperial succession. In the end, the horror of Capri lies not merely in what Tiberius commanded, but in how many participated, enabled, or ignored the suffering that unfolded behind stone walls overlooking a sea whose endless rhythm concealed the truth for almost 2,000 years. The rituals, the chambers, the attendants, the silence, all of it reveals a system that thrived because those who served the emperor feared him more than they valued the lives of the innocent, and those who governed Rome chose comfort over conscience. And within that system, children like Gaius Marcellinus and Livia Sabina became names without voices, their stories pieced together only when time, erosion, and accident finally returned their traces to the world. When historians attempt to quantify the human cost of Tiberius's secluded decade on Capri, they confront the same challenge that plagues all investigations into state-sanctioned exploitation. The imperial administration recorded only what benefited its authority, and the lives of those who entered the Ministeria Secretora were never considered significant enough to document beyond their initial arrival. Yet through the scattered remains of steward rosters, supply lists for the villas, and transportation logs discovered in the archives of Misenum, scholars estimate that between 70 and 120 youths passed through the imperial household on Capri during those years, a number that does not account for the undocumented children taken from rural estates, enslaved foreigners brought as gifts, or the occasional captives seized from shipwrecks off the Campanian coast. When one considers the rotational nature of the attendants, the evidence of repeated plaster inscriptions, and the accumulation of biological traces discovered in the lower chambers, the scale of suffering expands beyond any tidy historical figure, forming instead a grim silhouette of lives consumed by the emperor's obsessions and erased from official memory. For the few who survived their time on the island, survival itself became a kind of sentence, for they returned to society bearing the weight of experiences they could not articulate without risking prosecution for defaming the emperor. Some were quietly reassigned to distant estates, their identities changed and their service records altered to suggest ordinary domestic labor, while others entered monastic communities in later decades, seeking refuge in obscurity as a way to escape the memories bound to Capri's cliffs. A fragmentary funerary inscription from Ostia mentions a former imperial attendant named Nereus, who never again approached the sea, a haunting phrase that suggests trauma too deep to express directly. Scholars believe that the psychological scars borne by these survivors rippled through succeeding generations, shaping patterns of silence within families that avoided any reference to imperial service lest the past reawaken its buried horrors. The erasure of Capri's true history did not occur spontaneously. It was manufactured deliberately through a combination of political ambition, moral reconstruction, and historiographical revision. When Caligula succeeded Tiberius, he inherited not only the throne, but also the delicate task of preserving the dynasty's legitimacy, and allowing the public to dwell on the atrocities associated with Capri would have undermined the Julio-Claudian lineage at the moment he needed its authority most. Thus, he permitted only vague whispers of his predecessor's depravity to circulate, fragments of scandal framed as moral caution rather than indictment, ensuring that the deeper, more systematic abuses remained unspoken. Later, under Claudius and Nero, official historians avoided probing too deeply into the island's past, both out of fear of resurrecting dangerous rumors and because imperial historiography increasingly focused on the grandeur of Rome rather than the private excesses of its rulers. By the 4th century, when Christian chroniclers reshaped Rome's narrative to emphasize divine providence and moral reform, any mention of Tiberius's rituals on Capri served primarily as a rhetorical device to contrast pagan decadence with Christian virtue, and even then the descriptions remained generalized, emphasizing sin and corruption without preserving the human voices of the victims. This selective framing effectively buried the truth beneath layers of theological interpretation, making it easier for later generations to condemn the emperor abstractly while forgetting the children whose lives had been extinguished in the island's shadows. It was not until the 21st century, when archaeologists began re-examining the foundations of Via Jovis, that the silences ruptured. In 2007, a team investigating seismic instability beneath the eastern terrace uncovered a collapsed subchamber filled with rubble, animal bones, and human remains that bore signs of violent struggle, including fractured phalanges, displaced teeth, and a sequence of scratch marks suggesting an attempt to escape through a stone crevice too narrow for a child's shoulders. Radiocarbon dating placed the remains squarely within the final years of Tiberius's residence, and mitochondrial DNA analysis revealed that at least 3 of the skeletons belonged to adolescents, 2 male and 1 female, each between 12 and 15 years old. The most chilling discovery, however, came when conservators lifted a limestone block and found beneath it a thin wooden tablet preserved by mineral accretion, its surface etched with a message in a trembling hand. The tablet, examined under multispectral imaging, revealed the faint outline of a plea that appears to have been carved with a shard of pottery, the letters uneven, jagged, and deeply scored, as though each stroke required immense effort. Scholars believe the message was written in the final moments before the chamber collapsed, perhaps during an earthquake or structural failure that trapped its occupants. The text reads, Si volcum haberum, disserem de nobis, sed mare tacet. If I had a voice, I would speak of us, but the sea is silent. The weight of these words extends beyond their literal meaning, for they encapsulate nearly 2,000 years of suppressed testimony, a reminder that the true victims of Capri were not the emperors whose reputations endured, but the children whose suffering lingered in silence beneath layers of rock, plaster, and historical omission. Although the sea swallowed their cries, time restored their message, allowing modern eyes to witness what ancient pens refused to preserve. And as researchers prepared the tablet for archival storage, they discovered a final inscription carved into the back, perhaps by another hand, perhaps earlier, perhaps during a moment of stolen secrecy. It contained only 4 Latin words, simple yet devastating, a message that seems intended not for contemporaries but for those in a distant future who might one day uncover the truth. Nos vivimus in umbra. We live in the shadows. When the archaeologists finally emerged from the sealed chamber beneath Via Jovis and carried the tablet into the light, they felt the same shudder that ran through the team who uncovered the curled skeleton decades earlier. For both discoveries forced the world to confront what the sea, the cliffs, and the empire had spent nearly 2,000 years trying to conceal. And in that moment, the story once dismissed as rumor, moral slander, or exaggerated rhetoric revealed its physical truth in the bones of children, the scratch marks on stone, and the trembling inscriptions carved by hands that knew no one would hear them. The brutality of Tiberius's hidden rites on Capri is not simply a tale of imperial cruelty, but a reminder of how history bends itself around power, shaping narratives that protect the mighty while allowing the vulnerable to disappear into silence. And as we trace the remnants of Gaius Marcellinus, Livia Sabina, and the countless unnamed youths who entered those chambers and never returned, we recognize that their suffering endured longer than the empire that consumed them, living on in fractures, pigments, and whispered fragments that survived by accident rather than intention. This is what Rome tried to hide, and the attempt reveals as much about the empire as the acts themselves. For when a civilization decides that some lives exist only to serve the desires of the powerful, it constructs systems that bury truth beneath stone, water, and ideology, trusting that time will erase what conscience cannot bear. Yet time does not always obey, and the earth remembers what scribes refuse to record, returning the voices of the silenced, in forms that demand recognition even when they cannot demand justice. Every skeleton we find, every carved line preserved in plaster, every crumpled tablet rescued from collapse, restores a measure of dignity to those whose suffering was meant to vanish, and their final message, fragile, wounded, but enduring, we live in the shadow. This is the story historians tried to bury. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever.